Tonight, we gather in this quiet space to receive the Buddha's most precious offerings. Stories that illuminate the path from suffering to peace, from confusion to clarity, from restlessness to rest. You don't need to have studied Buddhism or know anything about meditation. You just need to be here, exactly as you are. The Buddha taught that peace isn't something we achieve or earn. It's something we uncover, like brushing away dust from a mirror that's always been reflecting light. Tonight's stories will help you brush away that dust, gently, without force, with the kind of patience that knows you're already whole. This is Buddha Bedtime Stories, your sanctuary for the sacred ordinary, where ancient wisdom meets your very human need for rest and understanding. Before we journey into these teachings, I have a question for you. What do these Buddhist stories bring to your nights? Is it peace that finds you here? A quieting of the restless thoughts that chase themselves in circles? Or perhaps a deeper sense of connection to something vast and timeless? Please share in the comments. Your words might be exactly what another listener needs to hear. The stories and teachings we'll explore aren't separate from your life. They're about your worries, your hopes, your relationships, your struggles to find ease in a difficult world. The Buddha spoke to the human condition with such clarity and compassion that his words still land in our hearts today, as relevant as ever. You might drift in and out of awareness as we go. You might fall asleep before we finish. This is not only okay, it's perfect. These teachings work on levels deeper than the conscious mind. Let them do their work while you rest. Take a moment now to truly settle yourself. Notice where your body makes contact with what supports you. Is there anywhere that's calling for adjustment? Maybe your arms need to rest differently, or your neck wants more support. Listen to your body's wisdom and respond with kindness. Find that position where you could stay for a long while, where comfort becomes the foundation for deep listening. Now bring your attention to your breath, but don't try to change it. Just notice it. Feel one complete breath cycle, from the first whisper of inhale to the final release of exhale, and one more, this time consciously inviting your whole body to soften with the out-breath. Beautiful. Let us begin this journey together with our first story. In an ancient temple, there lived a cat named Tama, who seemed to do nothing but sleep in the sun. While monks meditated, Tama napped. While monks worked, Tama lounged. While monks studied, Tama groomed herself lazily. To visitors, the cat appeared to be a freeloader, enjoying the temple's hospitality while contributing nothing. A new abbot arrived at the temple, a young man named Ryokan, who believed in efficiency and purpose. He was troubled by the cat's apparent uselessness. "That cat does nothing," he complained to the senior monks. "She just sleeps and eats. Why do we keep her?" The senior monks smiled but said nothing. They had learned long ago that Tama's purpose wasn't obvious to everyone immediately. Ryokan decided the cat had to earn her keep. He began assigning her duties: chase mice in the storage rooms, patrol the gardens for pests, anything productive. But Tama ignored these assignments. She continued her routine of sleeping in sunny spots, occasionally stretching, maintaining her serene presence. Frustrated, Ryokan announced his intention to find the cat a new home. "We cannot justify feeding an animal that serves no purpose." That very night, as if to prove his point, mice invaded the temple's grain storage. Ryokan rushed to wake the cat, to put her to work catching these pests. But he couldn't find her. She wasn't in any of her usual sleeping spots. Then he heard it. A soft, steady purring coming from the storage room. He opened the door and found Tama sitting perfectly still in the center of the room. She wasn't chasing mice. She wasn't even moving. She was just sitting, present, alert, purring quietly. And there were no mice in the room. Ryokan could hear them in the walls, could hear them trying to enter, but none crossed the threshold where Tama sat. Her mere presence, her calm watchfulness, was keeping them at bay. She didn't need to chase them. She didn't need to kill them. She just needed to be there. Ryokan watched for over an hour. Tama never moved, never broke her meditation. She was like a guardian statue, her presence creating a boundary that mice instinctively wouldn't cross. Finally, as dawn approached, she stood, stretched, and calmly walked out of the storage room, heading for her favorite sunny spot. The senior monks found Ryokan standing in wonder. "She does have a purpose," he said quietly. "Yes," one of the senior monks replied, "but not the purpose you imagined. You wanted her to chase and hunt. You wanted visible action, measurable productivity. But Tama's gift is presence. She protects through being, not through doing. The mice sense a predator and stay away. She doesn't have to work hard. She just has to be what she is." Another monk added, "We tried to train cats before Tama. Cats that were energetic hunters, always chasing, always catching. But they disturbed the temple's peace. They left dead mice everywhere. They were exhausting to live with. Tama protects quietly, peacefully, just by being present. Her seeming laziness is actually perfect efficiency." Ryokan bowed to the cat, who had settled into a patch of morning sun and was already falling asleep. "Forgive me, Tama. I judged your worth by my standards instead of understanding your actual purpose." From that day forward, Ryokan looked at everything in the temple differently. The old plum tree that no longer bore fruit he had planned to cut down. But the monks showed him how its branches were perfect for birds to nest in, how its shade cooled the meditation hall on summer days, how its twisted trunk was beautiful in a way that useful, productive trees never were. Its purpose wasn't production. Its purpose was beauty and shelter. The ancient bell that was cracked and no longer rang clearly, he wanted to replace. But the monks explained that its imperfect tone was beloved, that its crack created a unique sound found nowhere else, and that generations of monks had learned to meditate to this particular tone. Its flaw was actually its distinction. The novice monk who seemed slow at learning, whom Ryokan had considered asking to leave, turned out to be extraordinarily patient with visitors, able to sit with grieving people for hours without becoming uncomfortable. His slowness at intellectual tasks was balanced by his gift for compassionate presence. "I've been judging everything by a narrow standard," Ryokan confessed to the senior monks. "Productivity, efficiency, obvious usefulness. But the temple isn't a business, it's an ecosystem. Everything has its place, its purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately obvious or doesn't fit conventional measures of value." He spent hours watching Tama, learning from her. She seemed to do nothing, yet her presence maintained order. She appeared lazy, yet she was perfectly alert when needed. She looked like a burden, yet she contributed essential value. She taught that being can be as important as doing, that presence can accomplish what action cannot, that some purposes are served by appearing purposeless. One day, a wealthy donor visited the temple and was offended to see a cat sleeping on expensive cushions in the main hall. "Why do you allow this animal such privilege? She produces nothing." Ryokan smiled and told the story of Tama and the mice. She produces protection through presence. She contributes peace through her serene being. Her value can't be measured in conventional terms, but it's real and essential. She teaches us that purpose isn't always about production or visible action. Sometimes purpose is about simply being what you are, fully and completely in the right place. The donor looked skeptical, so Ryokan continued. "You're a wealthy merchant. You measure value in terms of production, profit, and tangible results, but not everything valuable can be measured that way. How do you measure the worth of beauty, of peace, of a presence that prevents problems rather than solving them? Tama's purpose is subtle but essential. Without her, we would have chaos. With her, we have order. That she achieves this through napping rather than through frantic activity doesn't diminish her contribution." Years passed, and eventually Tama grew old and died. The monks gave her a funeral with full honors, acknowledging her years of service. They tried to find another cat to serve her function, but none could quite match her particular gift. Some cats were too aggressive, chasing everything and disturbing the peace. Others were too passive, failing to maintain the protective presence that Tama had embodied. Finally, they found a cat with Tama's quality, a calm, serene presence that protected through being rather than doing. This cat they named Tama II, and she took up residence in the sunny spots her predecessor had loved, continuing the tradition of purposeful purposelessness. Ryokan, now an old man himself, would often sit with the new Tama and remember the lessons the original had taught him. "Every being has its place in the whole," he would tell young monks, "but that place might not look like what we expect." Purpose isn't always about obvious productivity. Sometimes it's about being present, being yourself, contributing in ways that aren't measurable but are nonetheless essential. He would point to the sleeping cat. Tama teaches us not to judge too quickly, not to assess worth by narrow standards, not to dismiss what we don't immediately understand. She teaches us that the temple, like all of life, is an ecosystem where even the apparently useless serves a purpose, where presence matters as much as action, where being is as valuable as doing. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own purpose. Perhaps you've been judging yourself by standards that don't fit what you actually are. Perhaps you've been trying to be productive in ways that go against your nature. Perhaps you've been dismissing your own value because it doesn't fit conventional measures. What if your purpose, like Tama's, is partly about presence, about being what you are, where you are, contributing value that isn't always visible or measurable? What if your times of rest, of apparent inactivity, of just being present, are actually serving important purposes that busy productivity never could? You don't have to chase and hunt and constantly produce to have worth. Sometimes protection comes through peaceful presence. Sometimes order is maintained through calm being. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is rest completely, be present fully, and trust that your very existence contributes to the whole in ways you may never fully understand. Sleep now like Tama, knowing that even in sleeping, you serve a purpose. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away, but something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of Mu in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned." My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one. The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. "Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past." He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes, but these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's piece came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded. Many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. "Kenzo has abandoned proper technique," they said. "He's making mistakes deliberately." This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned, it was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery, not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. "The technique serves spontaneity," he would tell students. "You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art." One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity." He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. "I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident. That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened." Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between: technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging?" The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. There was a devoted student named Akiko who studied with a Zen master for many years. She took meticulous notes on every teaching, every conversation, every insight that arose during her practice. Her room was filled with journals and scrolls, a massive accumulation of written wisdom that she treasured as proof of her learning. She would often review her notes, rereading old insights, checking her understanding against what she had written. The notes gave her a sense of security, a feeling that she was capturing and keeping the teachings, making sure nothing was lost. One day, her master, a woman named Mumon, came to Akiko's room and looked at the mountains of notes with a frown. "What is all this?" "My notes," Akiko said proudly. "Everything you've taught me over 5 years. Every koan we've discussed. Every meditation instruction. All preserved here." "Preserved?" Mumon repeated thoughtfully. "Like pickled vegetables?" Akiko laughed at the comparison. "Something like that, so I can return to these teachings whenever I need them." "Show me your understanding of the teaching we discussed yesterday," Mumon said. Akiko reached for her most recent journal and began reading her notes. Mumon stopped her. "Not what you wrote. Your understanding, without the notes." Akiko tried to explain the teaching from memory, but found she couldn't. Her mind kept trying to recall what she had written, rather than expressing what she actually understood. The notes had become a barrier between her and direct understanding. "You've been writing instead of learning," Moomin said gently. "You've been preserving teachings on paper rather than absorbing them into your being. You have accumulated much, but understood little." Akiko felt defensive. "But these notes help me remember. Without them, I would forget." "What you forget wasn't truly learned," Mumon replied. "And what you truly learn doesn't need notes to remember. Knowledge that lives only on paper is dead knowledge. It has to live in you to be real knowledge." She picked up one of Akiko's journals and read a passage about meditation. "Do you remember writing this?" "Yes, from 3 years ago. You were teaching about working with a restless mind." "And do you work with a restless mind this way?" Mumon asked. Akiko realized she didn't. She had written the teaching down, but never actually integrated it into her practice. The notes gave her the illusion of learning without the reality of it. Mumon set down the journal. "Tonight, I want you to burn all these notes." "What?" "No. These represent years of work. These represent years of writing. That's not the same as years of learning. Burn them. If the teachings took root in you, they'll survive the burning. If they didn't, then keeping the notes is just a way of avoiding that truth." Akiko spent a sleepless night agonizing over this instruction. Her notes felt like treasures, like her spiritual wealth accumulated over the years. But she trusted Mumon, so the next evening, she built a fire and with trembling hands began feeding her journals to the flames. As each notebook burned, she felt panic and loss, years of writing disappearing into smoke and ash. But she continued, page by page, until everything was gone. She sat looking at the ashes, feeling empty and devastated. The next morning, Mumon asked her to explain a teaching from 2 years ago. Without her notes to consult, Akiko had to reach for what she actually remembered, what had actually integrated into her understanding. She was surprised to find that she could explain the teaching, not in the exact words she had written, but in her own words that expressed real understanding. "You see," Mumon said, "what truly became part of you survived the burning. What was only on paper is gone, but it was already gone in the sense that it wasn't really yours. You possessed the notes, but you didn't possess the understanding they were meant to point toward." Over the following weeks, something shifted in Akiko's learning. Without notes to rely on, she had to actually integrate teachings as they came. She had to pay a different kind of attention, not the attention of someone recording for later, but the attention of someone learning for now. She discovered that taking notes had been a way of deferring understanding. "I'll write this down and understand it later," she would think. But later never came. The act of writing created the illusion of learning while allowing actual learning to be postponed indefinitely. Now, without that crutch, she had to understand immediately. She had to ask questions in the moment rather than writing down words to puzzle over later. She had to practice teachings directly rather than preserving them for future practice. Her understanding deepened rapidly. The teachings weren't sitting on paper waiting to be reviewed. They were living in her actions, her responses, her way of being in the world. "Why did you have me burn the notes?" Akiko asked Mumon one day. "Was it to punish me for relying on them?" "Not punishment," Mumon replied. "Liberation. You were carrying a library but not living the teachings. The notes made you feel like a good student, like you were capturing and preserving wisdom. But actually, they were preventing you from being transformed by that wisdom. You were collecting teachings like butterflies in a jar, beautiful but dead, instead of learning to fly. She looked at Akiko directly. The teachings aren't meant to be possessed. They're meant to be embodied. You can't embody something while you're busy writing it down and filing it away. The burning freed you from the illusion that learning means accumulating words on paper. A fellow student who still took extensive notes heard about Akiko's burned journals and was horrified. How can you not take notes? How will you remember everything? I don't remember everything, Akiko admitted. I remember what matters. What doesn't stick naturally wasn't ready to be integrated anyway. Before, I had notes on hundreds of teachings I didn't understand or practice. Now I have no notes, but I actually live the teachings that have taken root. The other student wasn't convinced, but months later came back to Akiko. I've been thinking about what you said. I realized I hide behind my notes. I write things down instead of changing my behavior. I accumulate teachings instead of applying them. Maybe I need to burn my notes too. Maybe, Akiko said. Or maybe you just need to recognize that the notes are a tool, not the goal. They can serve learning if you use them as temporary scaffolding that you eventually remove. But if you treat them as the achievement itself, they become obstacles. Years later, when Akiko became a teacher herself, she had an unusual policy. Students could take notes during the teachings, but at the end of each month, they had to burn them. If you understood, you don't need the notes, she would tell them. If you didn't understand, the notes won't help you. They'll just give you the illusion of understanding, while the real thing eludes you. Some students resisted this practice. But what if I forget important things? Then they weren't that important, Akiko would reply, or they weren't meant for you at this time. Trust that what you need to remember will stay with you. Trust that understanding that matters will integrate naturally. Let go of trying to capture and possess teachings. Let them flow through you, keeping what sticks and releasing what doesn't. One student said, "But I learn by writing. The act of writing helps me process and remember." Then write, Akiko allowed. But burn your notes afterward. Let writing be a process of learning, not a product of learning. Let it be the act of digestion, not the attempt at preservation. Write to understand in the moment, not to have something to refer back to. She showed them her empty shelves where journals used to be. I'm lighter now. I carry less paper, but more understanding. The teachings live in how I respond to difficulty, how I meet each moment, and how I treat people. They don't live in notes tucked away in storage. This is the difference between dead knowledge and living wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, what notes are you clinging to? What accumulations of knowledge or experience are you treating as possessions rather than processes? What have you written down, filed away, or tucked into memory, with the intention of understanding later, but later never comes? You don't need to keep everything. You don't need to preserve every insight, remember every lesson, or capture every moment of learning. What truly transforms you doesn't need notes to survive. It lives in you, changes you, and becomes part of how you move through the world. Rest now in the understanding that learning isn't about accumulation, but about integration. That wisdom lives not on shelves, but in actions. The most important teachings don't need to be written down because they write themselves into your very being. Let yourself be like the burned journals, emptied of words but full of understanding, lighter in paper but heavier in wisdom, possessing less but being more. The notes were never the point. The understanding they pointed toward was the point. And that understanding needs no paper to live on. It lives in you. It always has. Rest now in that living wisdom, requiring no notes, no preservation, no recording. Just being, knowing, understanding from the inside out. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness." "Or it's a story," the governor replied. "This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them." He held the bowl up to the light. "I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea." A perfect bowl says nothing except, "Look how skilled the potter is." This bowl says something more interesting. "Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone." Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. "This crack," the emperor said finally, "is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial." He looked directly at Masao. "Did you make this crack deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Masao admitted. "It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it." "Then it's a gift," the emperor replied. "A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws." After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. "That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's cracked," Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. "Exactly," the tea master replied. "Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly." He held the bowl carefully. "In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest." Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. "I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw," Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. "I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way." He would show students 2 bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain monastery lived an old abbess named Ren, who kept in her private chamber an unusual mirror. The mirror was ancient, its surface darkened and worn until it reflected almost nothing. Visitors who saw it would often remark on its uselessness. "Your mirror shows nothing," they would say. "Why keep it? Get a new one that actually works." But Ren treasured this mirror and looked into it every morning. "It shows me exactly what I need to see," she would reply, though she never explained what she meant. One day, a vain young woman named Ayame came to the monastery seeking spiritual guidance. She was beautiful and knew it, spending hours each day on her appearance, constantly checking her reflection in every available surface. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her looks. During her first meeting with Ren, Ayame couldn't stop glancing at the darkened mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of herself. But the mirror showed nothing. just a dark, murky surface with barely a hint of reflection. "Your mirror is broken," Ayame said with annoyance. "Don't you want to see yourself?" "I see myself perfectly well in this mirror," Ren replied. "What do you see?" "Nothing. It's too dark." "Exactly," Ren said, and smiled. Ayame didn't understand, but as the days passed and she continued her stay at the monastery, she found herself repeatedly drawn to Ren's useless mirror. She would stand before it, searching for her reflection, finding almost nothing. It was deeply unsettling. Every other mirror showed her who she was, or at least showed her what she looked like. This mirror showed nothing. After a week, Ayame mentioned her frustration to Ren. "I hate your mirror. I keep looking into it hoping to see myself, but there's nothing there." "And what does that nothing teach you?" Ren asked. "That the mirror is broken." "Or that you're looking for the wrong thing," Ren suggested. "Every mirror you've ever looked into has shown you your face, your hair, your features. You've spent years studying that reflection, knowing exactly what you look like. My mirror can't show you that, so it forces you to consider, if you can't see your face, what else might you see? If appearance isn't available, what remains?" Ayame thought about this. When she looked into normal mirrors, she saw features she judged: eyes too small, nose too sharp, skin not smooth enough. She saw an image she tried to perfect, control, improve. The looking was never really seeing. It was evaluating, criticizing, trying to manage how others would perceive her. But in Ren's dark mirror, there was nothing to evaluate, no features to judge, no appearance to control. Just dark surface and, if she looked very carefully, the barest hint of a form. Not details, just presence. "What do you see when you look in your mirror?" Ayame asked Ren. "Nothing that can be improved or criticized," Ren replied. "Nothing that age can diminish or beauty can enhance. Just the simple fact of being here, looking. The mirror that shows everything tempts you to judge what you see. The mirror that shows nothing releases you from judgment." She came to stand beside Ayame before the dark mirror. "Look at us now, standing here together. Can you see our faces?" "Barely," Ayame admitted. "Can you tell which of us is more beautiful?" "No." "Can you see our ages, our features, the details that usually define us?" "No." "Then we stand equal before this mirror," Ren said. "Not as beautiful or plain, young or old, but simply as two beings, present in this moment. The mirror that shows nothing strips away all the superficial ways we distinguish ourselves and leaves only the essential fact: we are here." Over the following weeks, Ayame found herself looking into Ren's mirror more than any of the clear mirrors in the monastery. At first, this puzzled her. Why would she choose the mirror that showed nothing? But gradually she understood. She was tired of the constant judgment that came with seeing her reflection clearly. Tired of always evaluating, always trying to improve, always wondering if she looked acceptable. The dark mirror gave her relief from all that. It let her be present without being perceived, even by herself. It let her exist without the burden of appearance. "I think I'm beginning to understand," Ayame told Ren one morning. "The mirror that shows nothing is actually showing me something very important. That I exist independent of how I look. That there's a me underneath or beyond appearance. I've spent so many years focused on my reflection that I forgot there's someone doing the looking. Ren nodded with satisfaction. The mirror that shows everything directs your attention outward, to surface and appearance. The mirror that shows nothing directs your attention inward, to the awareness that's looking. One mirror shows you an object to be evaluated. The other mirror reveals you as a subject who is aware. She touched the darkened surface gently. Most people think a mirror's value is in how clearly it reflects. But sometimes a mirror's greatest value is in what it doesn't show. The absence of reflection can teach what the presence of reflection never could. Ayame stayed at the monastery for 6 months, and during that time, her relationship with mirrors changed completely. She no longer felt compelled to check her reflection constantly. When she did look in clear mirrors, she no longer saw an image to be judged, but simply a face, no more or less significant than any other face. "Your dark mirror freed me," she told Ren when she prepared to leave. "I thought I needed to see myself clearly to know who I was, but actually, seeing myself clearly kept me trapped in appearance, in judgment, in the endless work of managing how I looked. Your mirror that showed nothing helped me discover the me that exists beyond appearance." After Ayame left, other students asked Ren about the mirror's teaching. "Why not just remove all mirrors?" one asked. "If the point is to free people from attachment to appearance, why have mirrors at all?" "Because running from mirrors is still being controlled by them," Ren explained. "The person who avoids all mirrors is as attached to appearance as the person who constantly looks. They're just attached to not looking rather than to looking. The dark mirror teaches something different. It teaches how to look without judgment, how to be aware of appearance without being enslaved by it." She held up the darkened mirror for the students to see. "This mirror shows that appearance and essence are not the same. The clear mirror shows you appearance so clearly that you might mistake it for essence. This dark mirror removes appearance and asks, what remains? What are you when you can't see your face? That question leads to wisdom." A philosophical student asked, "But isn't the dark mirror just another form of illusion? It hides reality rather than revealing it." "Does it?" Ren replied. "The clear mirror shows you how light reflects off your features at this particular moment from this particular angle. Is that reality? Or is that also just one kind of information, one kind of seeing? The dark mirror shows you something the clear mirror can't. Your existence independent of your reflection. Both mirrors have their uses. The question is whether you're wise enough to learn from each what it has to teach." Years later, when Ren was dying, she gave the darkened mirror to her successor with specific instructions. "Keep this mirror, even though students will mock it, even though visitors will offer to replace it. This mirror teaches what cannot be taught in words, that sometimes absence reveals more than presence, that sometimes nothing shows more than everything, that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from what we cannot see rather than from what we can." Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine looking into a mirror that shows nothing, not because the mirror is broken, but because it's teaching you something that clear mirrors never could. Without your reflection to evaluate and judge, what remains? Without your appearance to manage and improve, who are you? The mirror that shows nothing is inviting you to meet yourself beyond surface, beyond image, beyond all the ways you've learned to see yourself through others' eyes. In the dark mirror, there's just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being here without needing to look any particular way. Rest now in the dark mirror's teaching. Let yourself be unseen, unreflected, undefined by appearance. Let yourself exist in the space beyond image, where judgment can't reach, where evaluation has no meaning, where you simply are without needing to be any particular way. The mirror shows nothing, and in that nothing, everything essential is revealed. Sleep in that revelation tonight. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly, whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection." Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. "I thought mastery meant perfect execution," Soho told his students later. "I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans." He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. "These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence." One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference. A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asks Soho for guidance. How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path, Soho replied. Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence. He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating. I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough. You've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing, and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly. but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable." "You built it intuitively," Takeo replied slowly, "while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation." An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. "This wall shouldn't have stood," he said finally. "By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't." Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. He found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" "My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive." He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. "The crooked wall saved my life," Takeo would tell students. not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth. Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, "So should we ignore all the traditional methods?" "No," Takeo replied. "Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works, rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses." He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. "This wall is a better teacher than any master mason," he would say. "It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard." The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley, the way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. "My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction?" "Tell me about your son," Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. "It's backwards," she insisted. "Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature." "Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing," Fumiko suggested gently. "Is he talented musically?" "Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty." "Doesn't it?" Fumiko asked. "The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong." She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. "Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself." This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a coastal village where dangerous rocks lurked beneath the waves, there stood a lighthouse that had saved countless ships from destruction. The lighthouse keeper was a man named Tomo, who had tended the light faithfully for 20 years, never missing a night, never letting the beacon fail. Tomo took great pride in his work. Each evening as he lit the lamp, he would think about the ships that would see his light and know where the safe passage lay. He imagined grateful sailors steering clear of the rocks because of his vigilance. His purpose was clear, his contribution visible, his worth measured in ships that arrived safely rather than wrecking on the shore. But then came a period in Tomo's life when everything fell apart. His wife died after a long illness. His adult son, with whom he'd been close, moved to a distant city and rarely wrote. His closest friend in the village passed away suddenly. Within the span of 6 months, Tomo lost everyone who mattered most to him. He fell into a deep despair. He no longer felt the satisfaction he once had in his work. The lighthouse seemed meaningless, his life empty, his purpose hollow. He felt lost, as if he were stumbling through darkness with no light to guide him, no sense of direction, no hope that things would improve. Yet, despite his inner darkness, Tomo continued to light the lighthouse every night. It was a habit, a duty, the automatic continuation of what he had always done. But there was no joy in it anymore, no sense of meaning. He lit the lamp because that's what lighthouse keepers do, not because he felt it mattered. He would stand in the lamp room at night, watching the light sweep across the dark water, and think, I'm supposed to be the one providing light, but I'm drowning in darkness. I'm supposed to guide others to safety, but I'm completely lost in myself. What right do I have to stand here pretending to know the way when I can't find my own path? One stormy night, as Tomo stood in the lamp room feeling particularly hopeless, there was a knock at the lighthouse door. He descended to find a sailor, soaking wet, nearly hypothermic. who had been thrown from his ship when a wave swept over the deck. "I saw your light," the sailor gasped as Tomo pulled him inside. "I was in the water, being pulled toward the rocks. I thought I was going to die. Then I saw your light, and I swam toward it. Your light saved my life." Tomo brought the man warm clothes, hot tea, and blankets. As the sailor recovered by the fire, he kept repeating his gratitude. "If your light hadn't been there, I would have been smashed against the rocks. I couldn't see anything else, but I could see your light. It showed me which way to swim." After the sailor left the next morning, rescued by his ship, which had returned looking for him, Tomo sat for a long time thinking about what had happened. He had been so focused on his own inner darkness that he had forgotten what his light actually did. It didn't require him to feel enlightened. It didn't need him to be free of darkness himself. It just needed to shine. The sailor didn't care that the lighthouse keeper was lost and grieving. The sailor didn't need Tomo to have all the answers or to be living a perfect life. The sailor just needed the light to be there, marking the safe passage, showing where the dangers were. A Zen monk who lived at the village had heard about the rescued sailor. He came to visit Tomo at the lighthouse. "I've noticed you've been struggling," the monk said gently. "Since your losses, I see the darkness in you." Tomo nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "I light this beacon every night, but I feel like a fraud. How can I guide others when I'm lost myself? How can I provide light when I'm full of darkness?" The monk looked up at the lamp tower. "Does the lighthouse need to understand navigation to be useful? Does it need to have sailed all the seas to show where the rocks are? Does it need to feel happy and fulfilled to save lives?" "No," Tomo admitted. "It just needs to shine." "Exactly," the monk said. "You think your inner darkness disqualifies you from helping others, but actually, your willingness to keep the light burning despite your darkness makes your service even more valuable. You're not helping others because you have everything figured out. You're helping them because you do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel." He touched Tomo's shoulder. Many people believe they can't help others until they're completely healed themselves. Until they've solved all their problems, found all their answers, achieved enlightenment or happiness or wholeness. But if everyone waited until they were completely well before helping others, no one would ever help anyone. We're all broken in some way. We're all stumbling in the darkness of one kind or another. But we can still hold lights for each other. Tomo felt something shift inside him. "You're saying I can be lost and still guide others?" "You already are," the monk replied. "You've been doing it every night. Your grief, your despair, your sense of being lost, none of that prevented the light from shining. None of that stopped you from doing what needed to be done. You think you're a fraud because you're suffering while helping others. But actually, you're demonstrating something important. Service doesn't require personal perfection. It requires showing up and doing what needs to be done." Over the following weeks, Tomo began to see his work differently. He was still grieving. He still felt lost much of the time. The darkness inside him hadn't disappeared. But he understood now that his inner state didn't invalidate his outer contribution. Ships still needed guidance. The light still saved lives. His pain didn't make the light less bright. He thought about all the people who probably felt as he did, broken, lost, inadequate, questioning their right to help others when they themselves were struggling? How many people stopped offering their gifts because they felt they weren't whole enough, healed enough, enlightened enough? A young woman from the village came to him one day troubled. She was training to be a healer, but felt overwhelmed by her own anxieties and doubts. "How can I help heal others when I'm so broken myself?" she asked. Tomo took her up to the lamp room and showed her the light. This lighthouse doesn't need to be whole to be useful. It just needs to do its job. You don't need to have conquered all your fears and healed all your wounds to help others. You just need to offer what you can offer. Your brokenness doesn't disqualify you from service. Sometimes it actually makes you better at it because you understand suffering from the inside. He told her about the sailor he had saved while feeling completely lost. The sailor didn't need me to be happy. He needed me to keep the light on. The people you help won't need you to be perfect. They'll need you to offer your skills, your compassion, your presence, whatever you're capable of giving. And you can give those things even while you're struggling. Word spread about the lighthouse keeper's teaching. People who had been holding back from helping others because of their own problems began to reconsider. The teacher who was battling depression realized she could still teach well, that her students didn't need her to be joyful, just knowledgeable and present. The counselor struggling with his own failed marriage recognized he could still help other couples, that his challenges didn't erase his insights. The mentor, dealing with doubt about his own life choices, saw that he could still guide younger people. That uncertainty about his own path didn't prevent him from illuminating options for others. Tomoe's grief gradually softened over time. Years passed, and while he never stopped missing his wife and feeling the absence of his son, the acute pain dulled into a quieter sadness. The darkness inside him became less consuming. But he never forgot the lesson of that period, that he had kept the light burning through his darkest time, that ships had been saved even while he felt lost, that his inner darkness hadn't stopped the outward light. One evening, many years later, an old sailor came to the lighthouse. "Do you remember me?" the sailor asked. "You saved my life 20 years ago. I was thrown overboard in a storm. I saw your light and swam to it." Tomoe did remember. That was the night I needed most to know that what I was doing mattered. "Well, it mattered," the sailor said. "I went on to have a family. 3 children, 7 grandchildren now. All of them exist because you kept that light burning. And you know what I learned that night? I learned that when you're drowning in darkness, you don't need someone who has all the answers. You just need someone who's holding a light, even if they're struggling to hold it, even if they're not sure why they're bothering. You just need the light. It doesn't matter if the keeper is lost. It matters that the light is there." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what lights you've been withholding because you feel too broken to offer them. What help have you refused to give because you don't feel qualified, whole, or enlightened enough? What guidance have you withheld because you yourself feel lost? You don't need to have everything figured out to help someone else. You don't need to be healed completely to offer healing. You don't need to be free of darkness to hold light for others. The lighthouse keeper's inner darkness didn't stop ships from being saved. Your inner struggles don't invalidate the contribution you can make. keep your light burning, even in your dark nights. Not because you're perfect, but because someone out there is swimming in darkness toward whatever light they can find. Your light might be the one that saves them. And it doesn't matter that you feel lost. It only matters that you're still showing up, still doing what you can do, still offering what you can offer. Rest now in the understanding that you can be broken and still be useful, lost and still guide others, full of darkness and still provides light. The lighthouse doesn't need to understand the journey to mark the safe passage. It just needs to keep shining. So do you. Your inner darkness doesn't disqualify you from helping others. Sometimes it's what qualifies you most, because you understand what it's like to need a light in the darkness. Sleep now, lighthouse keeper, knowing that even in your darkest nights, your light has been saving lives. It always has been. It always will be. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, so she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular, the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made." Nao brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? "It's everything I spent my life learning not to create." The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, Nao reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included rather than denied imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Now, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. "These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true." The limitation stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all. But by then, her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings, but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. "Every limitation is a teacher," she would say. "It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't." My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions. They're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked. after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, "calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance." With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect, Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better, they just delayed it. Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. There was a master calligrapher named Yukiko who had devoted her entire life to the art of beautiful writing. For 60 years, she had practiced daily, creating works that were displayed in temples and palaces throughout the land. Her characters were considered the finest of her generation, but as she grew old, her hands began to shake. The tremor was slight at first, barely noticeable, but gradually it worsened, until she could no longer create the smooth flowing lines that had been her signature. The characters she wrote became jagged, uneven, broken by the involuntary movements of her aging hands. Yukiko was devastated. Calligraphy was not just her work, it was her identity, her life's purpose. She had defined herself through her art for 60 years. Now, unable to produce the quality of work she had maintained for decades, she felt her life was over. If she couldn't create beautiful calligraphy, what was she? She stopped taking commissions. She stopped teaching students. She sat in her studio, staring at blank paper, unable to bring herself to create imperfect work. Each day felt like waiting for death, as if her life had ended, even though her body continued. One day, a young calligrapher named Kenji came to visit her. He had studied her work and wanted to meet her before she died, as he had heard she was no longer creating. "Master Yukiko," he said, bowing deeply, "please, will you show me how you create such beautiful work?" "I can't," Yukiko replied bitterly. "My hands shake. I can no longer do what I once did. My time is over." "Show me anyway," Kenji persisted. "Show me what you do now, even if it's not what you once did." Reluctantly, to satisfy this persistent young man, Yukiko took up her brush. Her hand trembled as she moved it across the paper. The line broke and wavered. The character she was forming looked nothing like the smooth, perfect characters she had created for 60 years. But Kenji was staring at it with wonder. "This is extraordinary." "It's broken," Yukiko said. "It's everything I spent my life learning not to do." "It's alive," Kenji replied. "Your old work was perfect, but this has something your perfect work didn't have. It has a vulnerability. It has humanity. It shows the reality of the hand that made it, the tremor that comes with age, the imperfection that comes with being human. It's no less beautiful. It's beautiful in a different way." He pointed to specific places where the line broke. "See how this break creates a pause, a breath? See how this wobble adds energy, movement? You couldn't create these effects intentionally. They come from not being able to control everything, from allowing the reality of your condition to show." Yukiko looked at her shaky calligraphy with new eyes. She had been seeing only what it wasn't: smooth, controlled, perfect. She hadn't been seeing what it was: authentic, immediate, marked by the truth of her aging body. "You're saying my shaking hands aren't ending my art?" she asked. "They're changing it." "They're revealing a new possibility," Kenji said. "You've mastered perfection. You spent 60 years learning complete control. Now you're learning something else. How to create beauty without control. How to let your limitations become part of your art rather than obstacles to it. This isn't an ending. This is a beginning." Over the following months, Yukiko began to explore what Kenji had called a beginning. She stopped trying to fight against her tremor and started working with it. She let the shakiness show, let the broken lines be part of the aesthetic. Let her aging hands tell their own truth. The work she created was unlike anything she had done before. It had a raw quality, an honesty, a profound beauty that came from acceptance rather than mastery. People who saw it were moved in ways they couldn't quite explain. It touched something in them that perfect calligraphy never had. "Your new work feels more human," one viewer said. "The perfection was impressive, but this is relatable. This shows struggle and acceptance. This shows life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be." Other aging artists heard about Yukiko's transformation and came to see her. They too had been treating their declining abilities as endings, as tragedies that marked the end of their creative lives. Yukiko showed them something different. "What you call an ending is just a transition," she told a painter whose eyesight was failing. "You've lost what you had, yes, but loss creates space for something new. If you spend all your time mourning what's gone, you'll never discover what's trying to arrive." She showed them her shaky calligraphy. "These tremors would have horrified me 5 years ago. I would have hidden this work in shame. But I've learned that every ending contains a beginning. My hand's steady control had to end before I could begin learning to create beauty from their unsteady truth." A sculptor whose arthritis had made detailed work impossible asked, "But how do you accept the loss? How do you stop grieving what you can no longer do?" "I still grieve it sometimes," Yukiko admitted. "I still miss the feeling of complete control, the satisfaction of executing exactly what I envisioned. But I've discovered something. The part of me that created perfect calligraphy was actually quite limited. It could only create what I consciously intended. Now, with my shaking hands, I create things I never could have planned. The imperfection introduces an element beyond my control, and that element often produces more interesting results than my intentions ever did." She held up a piece of her new work. "See this character? I intended it to look one way. My tremor made it look another way. And the way it actually looks is more compelling than what I planned. The beginning I'm in now includes accident, chance, collaboration with my body's wisdom rather than domination of it." Kenji, who continued to visit Yukiko regularly, said, "You've become a better artist by becoming worse at control. Your mastery now includes accepting what you can't master. That's a higher skill than perfect technique ever was." Yukiko nodded. "When I had complete control, I could only create versions of what I already knew. Now, with partial control, I'm discovering things I didn't know were possible. The ending of my old art was the beginning of art I couldn't have created any other way." A Zen master who collected calligraphy commissioned a piece from Yukiko. When she delivered it, with all its shaky lines and broken strokes, he hung it in his meditation hall's place of honor. "This shows the essence of Zen," he told his students. "Perfection is static, fixed, dead. This work is dynamic, alive, accepting of change and impermanence." The master's tremor isn't a flaw in the work. It's the work teaching its deepest truth. That beauty includes imperfection. The endings contain beginnings. That loss creates space for discovery. Yukiko lived another 15 years, creating what many considered her finest work during this period. Critics called her late style revolutionary, noting how it had influenced a generation of younger artists to embrace imperfection and vulnerability in their work. When she finally died at 85, still creating tremor-marked calligraphy to the end, her students gathered to remember her. They spoke of her two periods, the 60 years of perfect control and the 15 years of acknowledged tremor. "Which period was greater?" a young student asked. An older student replied, "She was always great." But she became wise only in her second period, when she learned that endings contain beginnings. When she discovered that what you lose forces you to find what you didn't know was there. When she understood that every door that closes reveals another door you weren't seeing before. Tonight, as you rest, what endings are you mourning? What losses are you treating as pure conclusions with nothing beyond them? What abilities, relationships, or circumstances have ended that you're grieving, as if ending means death rather than transition? Every ending contains a beginning you can't see yet. The closing of one possibility opens others that couldn't have opened if the first possibility had continued. Your losses aren't just subtractions. They're also additions of space, of new potential, of directions you couldn't have gone while the old way remained available. What's ending in you right now isn't your conclusion, it's your transition. Something is completing, so something else can begin. The tremor that seems to be ruining your perfect lines is actually creating new kinds of beauty you couldn't have achieved through control alone. Rest now in acceptance of endings as beginnings in disguise. What's leaving is making room. What's breaking is revealing. What's ending is beginning, just not in ways you can recognize yet. Trust the ending. It knows what it's doing. Every conclusion contains a hidden opening, and you're moving toward it even as you mourn what's closing behind you. Sleep now in the space between ending and beginning, knowing that this space itself is fertile ground where something unexpected and beautiful is already starting to grow. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a village where strong winds frequently blew down from the mountains, there was a grove of trees that included many different species. There were tall, rigid pines that stood straight and proud. There were sturdy oaks with thick trunks and strong branches. And among these impressive trees, there grew a single weeping willow, whose branches hung down gracefully, swaying with every breeze. A young carpenter named Riku would come to this grove to select wood for his work. He admired the strong, straight pines and the solid oaks. These were trees that stood firm against the wind, that didn't bend or yield, that maintained their position no matter what the weather came. This, Riku thought, was what strength looked like. The weeping willow he barely noticed, and when he did, he pitied it. Its branches drooped instead of reaching proudly skyward. It swayed and bent with every wind. It seemed weak, yielding, almost pathetic compared to the strong trees around it. Then one year, a great storm came. The wind howled down from the mountains with unprecedented force. The rain fell in sheets. Lightning split the sky. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged. When it finally passed, Riku went to the grove to see what wood might be available from fallen trees. What he found shocked him. The strong pines, so tall and proud, had snapped like twigs. Their rigid trunks had broken under the force of the wind. The sturdy oaks had been uprooted, their strong but inflexible branches torn away. All across the grove lay the wreckage of trees that had stood firm, refused to yield, and had been destroyed for their rigidity. But the weeping willow still stood. Its branches, which had seemed so weak because they bent and swayed, had flexed with the wind rather than breaking against it. The tree that had appeared most fragile had survived when all the apparently strong trees had fallen. Riku sat beside the willow, looking at the destruction around it, trying to understand what he was seeing. Everything he thought he knew about strength was being challenged. The rig had broken. The yielding had survived. An old Buddhist nun named Kei was walking through the grove, surveying the damage from the storm. She saw Riku sitting in confusion and joined him. "The storm taught you something," she said. "I don't understand," Riku replied. "The strong trees broke. The weak ones survived. How can that be?" "You're confusing rigidity with strength," Kei said gently, "and flexibility with weakness. These are not the same things." She touched one of the willow's drooping branches. "This tree looks weak because it bends, but bending is what saved it." The rigid trees fought against the wind, trying to stand firm, refusing to yield. And the wind broke them. The willow didn't fight. It bent with the wind, yielded to forces it couldn't resist, and in that yielding, found the strength to survive. Riku listened carefully as Kei continued. "There's a principle in martial arts called Ju, which means gentleness or flexibility. The idea is that you don't meet force with force. You don't try to be harder than what's hitting you. Instead, you yield. You move with the energy coming at you. You redirect it rather than blocking it. This isn't a weakness. It's a different kind of strength." She gestured to the broken pines. These trees were strong in one way, but their strength was brittle. They could stand firm against normal winds, but when a force greater than their resistance came, they broke. The willow's strength is different. It has no brittleness because it has no rigidity. It can't break because it never stops bending. Over the following weeks, Riku began to see this principle everywhere. He watched how water, soft and yielding, could wear away stone over time. He noticed how the most rigid people in the village were often the most fragile when things didn't go their way. He observed how the people who could adapt and bend were often the ones who survived life's storms most intact. He changed his approach to carpentry. Instead of always seeking the hardest, most rigid woods, he began to appreciate woods with some flexibility, some give. He learned to work with the wood's natural tendencies rather than trying to force it into shapes it didn't want to take. His furniture became known for being both strong and graceful, able to bear weight while having a quality of flow and ease. But the deeper lesson was about how he lived his own life. Riku had always prided himself on being firm in his opinions, rigid in his principles, unwavering in his positions. He thought this made him strong, but he began to realize it made him brittle. When his wife suggested a different approach to something, his first instinct had always been to resist, to stand firm in his original idea. Now he began to consider, what if yielding wasn't losing? What if listening and adjusting weren't weaknesses but wisdom? When a client wanted changes to a piece he was building, instead of rigidly defending his design, he would flex, adapt, and incorporate their ideas. Often, the result was better than what he had planned. His yielding led to better outcomes than his resistance ever had. When life didn't go according to his plans, instead of fighting against reality, insisting things should be different, he began to bend with what was happening to adapt, to find ways to work with circumstances rather than against them. A young man from the village came to Riku seeking advice. "Everyone tells me I need to be strong, to stand firm, to never back down. But I don't feel strong when I do that. I feel brittle, like I'm about to break." Riku took him to see the weeping willow. The tree had grown even larger in the years since the storm, its graceful branches now spreading wide. "This tree survived a storm that destroyed every tree around it," Riku said. "Not because it was harder or more rigid, but because it knew how to yield. Look at how it moves with this breeze. It doesn't fight the wind, it dances with it." He touched one of the branches, pulling it down and watching it spring back when he released it. True strength includes flexibility. The ability to bend without breaking, to yield without collapsing, to adapt without losing your essential nature. The willow yields, but it doesn't uproot. It bends, but it doesn't break. This is a strength that lasts. The young man asked, "But how do you know when to stand firm and when to bend? Don't some things require us to be rigid, to not yield?" "Yes," Riku acknowledged. "The willow has strong roots. It's flexible in its branches, but grounded in its foundation. The key is knowing what's essential and what's not. Your core values, your true nature, these are like the willow's roots. They ground you, but your opinions, your plans, your preferences, these can be like the branches. They can bend, adapt, yield without threatening who you fundamentally are." He gestured to where the oak and pine had once stood. These trees tried to keep everything rigid. Every branch, every position. They couldn't distinguish between what was essential to hold firm and what could be released. So when the great test came, they lost everything. The willow knew what to hold and what to release. It held its roots and released its branches to the wind. That's wisdom. Years later, the weeping willow became a teaching symbol in the village. Parents would bring children to see it, telling them the story of the great storm. Teachers would use it to illustrate the difference between rigidity and strength. Couples in conflict would sit beneath it, reminding themselves that yielding to each other wasn't losing, but creating a relationship that could weather storms. Riku, now an old man, would still visit the willow regularly. He had learned his lesson deeply. His life had brought many storms, many winds that could have broken him if he had stood rigid against them. But he had learned to bend, to yield, to move with forces he couldn't resist. And like the willow, he had survived, even thrived, not despite his flexibility, but because of it. One day, a master carpenter from the capital came to the village seeking Riku's advice. "I'm known for my rigid standards, my unwillingness to compromise," the master said. "But I'm miserable, and my relationships are all strained. People say I should learn from you." Riku took him to the willow. "What do you see?" "A tree with drooping branches. It looks weak." "It's the only tree that survived the great storm. Everything that looked strong broke. This tree that looks weak stood firm, not through rigidity, but through flexibility." He let this sink in before continuing. "Your rigidity feels like strength because you're in control, imposing your will, but it's actually brittleness. When life brings forces stronger than your will, you'll break. Learn to bend. Learn to yield. Not in your core principles, but in your attachment to having everything your way. True mastery includes knowing when to stand firm and when to flow. Tonight, as you rest, notice where you're holding rigid. What positions are you gripping too tightly? What plans are you clinging to that life is asking you to release? Where might you need to be more like the weeping willow, yielding to forces you can't control, bending so you don't break? Strength isn't always about standing firm. Sometimes it's about flowing with what comes. Sometimes the greatest power is in yielding, adapting, and moving with life rather than against it. The willow survives because it doesn't fight battles it can't win. It bends, knowing that bending isn't breaking. Let yourself bend tonight. Let yourself yield to rest, to uncertainty, to whatever is. Don't be rigid in your expectations of how this should feel or what should happen. Flow like the willow's branches in the wind, trusting that your roots are strong enough to hold you even as you move with forces beyond your control. Yielding isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And tonight, it's the way to deep rest. In a coastal city, there lived a renowned mapmaker named Genji, who had charted more territory than any cartographer of his generation. His maps were detailed, accurate, and highly sought after by merchants, explorers, and military leaders. Every island, every coastline, every mountain range he documented was rendered with precision. But Genji had a practice that other mapmakers mocked. Whenever his knowledge ended, whenever he reached the limits of what had been explored and documented, he would leave the map blank. Large white spaces appeared on his charts, marked only with the words "unknown territory," or sometimes just left empty. Other mapmakers found this approach unprofessional. They would fill in the blank spaces with speculation, with reports from unreliable sources, with educated guesses. A map should be complete, they would argue. Blank spaces make it look unfinished. Blank spaces are honest, Genji would reply. They tell the truth, that we don't know what's there. Filling them with guesses tells a lie, that we do know. But the criticism stung, especially when clients would choose other mapmakers' complete maps over Genji's honest but incomplete ones. People wanted certainty, even false certainty. They wanted maps that told them what lay everywhere, even if those maps were partly fiction. One season, a wealthy merchant named Ichiro commissioned Genji to create a map for a trading expedition to distant islands. When Genji delivered the map, Ichiro was dismayed by the large blank areas. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Ichiro complained. "I need to know what's in these blank spaces. I need to plan my route." "What's in those spaces is unknown," Genji replied. "No reliable expedition has charted them. I can't tell you what I don't know." "But other mapmakers have filled in these areas," Ichiro protested. "They show islands, harbors, channels." "Based on speculation," Genji said. "Based on second-hand rumors and wishful thinking. If you sail using those maps, you'll be navigating by fantasy. My blank spaces at least tell you where certainty ends." Ichiro hired a different map maker who provided a complete map with no blank spaces. The expedition set sail using this fully detailed chart, confident in their route. 3 months later, the expedition returned, having lost 2 ships. They had found islands where the map showed open ocean, encountered reefs where the map showed safe passage, and wasted weeks exploring channels that didn't exist. The complete map had been worse than useless. It had been dangerous. Ichiro returned to Genji, chastened. Your blank spaces would have saved lives. If I had known we were entering unknown territory, I would have proceeded cautiously. Instead, I trusted a map that pretended to know, and that false certainty led to disaster. Blank spaces scare people, Genji acknowledged. They remind us how much we don't know, how limited our understanding is. But pretending we know more than we do is worse than admitting our ignorance. The blank space says, be careful here, proceed thoughtfully, don't assume. The falsely filled space says, it's safe to trust this, which is a dangerous lie. Word spread about Ichiro's disaster and Genji's honest maps. More clients began to value the blank spaces, recognizing them as marks of integrity rather than incompleteness. They learned to read Genji's maps differently. The detailed areas showed where knowledge was reliable. The blank areas showed where caution was needed. A young apprentice named Lin came to study with Genji. She had been trained by other map makers who filled in all spaces, and she struggled with Genji's insistence on leaving blanks. But we can make educated guesses, Lin argued. We know the general geography of the region. We can estimate where islands are likely to be. And we'd be wrong half the time, Genji replied. An educated guess isn't knowledge. It's speculation with a fancy name. If you mark speculation as if it's fact, you're lying to whoever uses your map. He spread out several maps on his table, his own with its blank spaces, and competitors' maps of the same regions with every space filled. These complete maps look more professional, more finished. But which is more honest? Which better serves someone trusting their life to the information? Lin began to understand, but still she resisted. People don't want to be told we don't know. They want answers, even imperfect ones. Then they want comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths, Genji said. And it's not our job to provide comforting lies. Our job is to chart what's known and clearly mark what's not. The blank space is information. It tells you something important. Here be dragons, or at least here be unknowns. Proceed carefully. Over time, Lin learned to value the blank spaces. She discovered that leaving areas blank required as much skill as filling them in. You had to know exactly where certainty ended, had to resist the temptation to extend your knowledge beyond its actual limits, and had to be comfortable with admitting you didn't have all the answers. One day, an explorer returned from a region Genji had left blank on his maps. The explorer had detailed charts of what was actually there. Your blank space wasn't really blank, the explorer said, showing Genji islands and coastlines that had been unknown before. Now it's not blank, Genji agreed, carefully adding the new information to his map. But it was blank until you explored it. That's how honest maps work. They grow as knowledge grows, but they never pretend to knowledge we don't have. He looked at the transformed map. See how the blank space has been replaced with detail. That's how it should happen. First honest acknowledgement of ignorance, then actual exploration, then knowledge replacing the unknown. But some map makers skip the first step and go straight to filling in spaces with imagination, which prevents anyone from recognizing what actually needs to be explored. Years later, Genji's blank spaces became the very thing that made his maps valuable. Explorers would deliberately seek out the blank spaces on Genji's maps, knowing these marked genuinely unexplored territory rather than cartographic guesswork. Military leaders trusted Genji's maps precisely because they showed where trust should end. A historian interviewing Genji late in his life asked, "Don't the blank spaces bother you? Don't you wish you could fill in all the unknown areas before you die?" "No," Genji replied without hesitation. "The blank spaces are the most honest things on my maps. They say, 'I don't know,' which is often the truest thing a person can say. I could fill them with speculation and fantasy, making maps that look complete. But I'd rather make true maps." He gestured to his life's work, hundreds of maps, all marked with careful detail where knowledge existed and honest blankness where it didn't. "These blank spaces are my legacy. They're me admitting the limits of my knowledge, refusing to pretend omniscience, valuing truth over completeness. Every mapmaker who fills in the unknown with guesses is choosing ego over integrity. I choose integrity." The historian looked at a particularly large blank space on one map. "Will this ever be filled in?" "Perhaps," Genji said. "Perhaps someone will explore that region and bring back reliable information, or perhaps it will remain blank forever. Either way, my map is honest right now, which is all any map can be." The mapmaker who fills in that space with speculation is making a map that's dishonest right now, in the hope that by accident he might be correct later. That's not mapmaking. That's gambling. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the blank spaces in your own understanding. Where are you filling in unknowns with speculation, pretending certainty you don't have, telling yourself and others you know things you actually don't? What would it mean to leave those spaces blank, to honestly mark them as unknown? The blank space isn't a failure. It's honesty. It's saying, "I don't know," instead of offering false certainty. It's admitting the limits of your understanding rather than pretending those limits don't exist. This feels vulnerable because we're taught that certainty is strength and uncertainty is weakness. But actually, false certainty is weakness disguised as strength, while honest uncertainty is strength willing to show itself. Rest now in your blank spaces. Let yourself not know what you don't know. Let yourself mark large areas of your life, your future, your understanding as unknown territory. This isn't an admission of failure, it's commitment to truth. The mapmaker with blank spaces serves better than the one with false completeness. So do you. Your honest "I don't know" is more valuable than anyone's false "I'm certain." Sleep in the blank spaces tonight where truth lives. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. "Nothing grows there," they said. "The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage." But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. "It's not that nothing can grow here," she said. It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here. The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things than the previous owners were trying to grow. She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden. Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions." "Are it conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hana admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. "See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not to spite them." She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. "This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn. But here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve." Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hana began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths, shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less, but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. A woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The shade garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating shade garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. "You're telling people to give up," they argued, "to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances." Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are? She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible. The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. The hardest thing, she would tell them, is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. In a monastery nestled between two mountains, there lived a young monk named Koji who took his responsibilities with tremendous seriousness. Each morning before dawn, he was assigned the task of sweeping the courtyard, and he approached this simple chore as if the monastery's very survival depended on it. Koji would begin his work with fierce determination, moving in perfectly straight lines from one end of the courtyard to the other. His broom strokes were methodical, precise, leaving no stone unswept. He would work for hours, his jaw clenched with concentration, his movements sharp and controlled. But the courtyard sat beneath an ancient cherry tree, and the tree had its own ideas about cleanliness. Even as Koji swept, new leaves would drift down, landing exactly where he had just cleaned. The wind would scatter dust across his perfectly swept paths. Birds would drop small twigs and seeds onto the stones. Each new bit of debris felt like a personal insult to Koji. He would rush to sweep it up, only to see 3 more leaves fall behind him. His sweeping became more frantic, more desperate. He began waking earlier and earlier, trying to finish before the wind picked up, before the birds became active, before new leaves could fall. The other monks noticed Koji's growing exhaustion. They saw the tension in his shoulders, the frustration etched across his young face. But they said nothing. This was between Koji and his teacher, Master Tenzin. Master Tenzin had been watching his student struggle for several weeks. He saw how Koji was making himself miserable over a courtyard that would never stay perfectly clean. Could never stay perfectly clean, was not meant to stay perfectly clean. One morning, as Koji was finishing his 3rd hour of sweeping, his movements now mechanical and joyless, Master Tenzin appeared beside him. "Why do you sweep in straight lines?" the master asked, his voice mild, curious. Koji stopped, surprised by the question. "Because that's the most efficient way to cover the ground, master. Straight lines ensure I don't miss any area." "I see," Tenzin nodded thoughtfully. And how is that working for you? Koji wanted to say it was working fine, but honesty prevented him. I can never seem to finish, Master. As soon as I clean one section, another becomes dirty. The courtyard is never completely perfect. Tenzin made a small sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else entirely. Today, try something different. Sweep in circles instead. Circles? Koji couldn't hide his confusion. But that's inefficient. Circles will overlap. I'll sweep the same areas multiple times. It doesn't make sense. Try it anyway, Tenzin said gently. Just for today. Sweep in circles and see what happens. Koji wanted to argue, wanted to explain all the logical reasons why circular sweeping was inferior to his systematic approach. But one did not argue with Master Tenzin. So he adjusted his grip on the broom and began to sweep in a large, slow circle. At first it felt wrong. His mind kept trying to straighten his path, to make it more efficient, more logical. But he continued, one circular sweep after another, round and round the courtyard. Something unexpected began to happen. Without the pressure to move in straight lines, to cover ground efficiently, to finish a measurable task, Koji's body started to relax. The circular motion became almost meditative, like a moving meditation. He noticed things he had missed during weeks of intense, focused sweeping. The way morning light caught the edges of wet stones, the sound his broom made, a soft whisper against the ground, the coolness of the air before the sun rose fully, the scent of cherry blossoms from the tree above. When a leaf fell in front of him, he swept it into his circle naturally. It became part of the dance rather than an interruption to his task. When the wind scattered dust behind him, he simply came round to it again on his next pass, unhurried, untroubled. After an hour of circular sweeping, Koji stopped and looked around. The courtyard wasn't perfectly clean. It couldn't be. But it was clean enough. It was cared for. And most surprisingly, Koji himself felt peaceful for the first time in weeks. Master Tenzin returned, as if he had known exactly when Koji would understand. "Well?" the master asked. "I don't understand," Koji admitted. "The courtyard isn't any cleaner than when I swept in straight lines. In fact, by logical measurement, it might be less clean, but somehow it feels right." "What changed?" Tenzin asked. Koji thought carefully. "I stopped trying to finish. Circles have no end point, so I couldn't race toward completion. I was just sweeping, being present with the broom, the stones, the leaves. The work itself became the point, not the finished product. And I realized the courtyard was never meant to be perfectly clean. It's outside, under a tree, in the world. Leaves will fall, wind will blow. This is natural. This is right. I was fighting against nature itself, trying to impose a perfection that doesn't exist." Tenzin smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to light up from somewhere deep inside. "For weeks, you've been at war with this courtyard, at war with leaves, at war with wind, at war with imperfection. How did that feel?" "Exhausting, Master. I was miserable. And now?" Koji looked down at his broom, at the courtyard with its scattered leaves and imperfect stones. "Now I understand that I'm not here to create perfection. I'm here to care for something that will never be perfect. And that's okay. That's actually the point." From that day forward, Koji swept in circles, other monks noticed the change in him. Where once he had been tight and tense, now he seemed relaxed. Where once his sweeping had been grim duty, now it seemed almost like a dance. Students would sometimes ask him, "Isn't circular sweeping inefficient?" And Koji would smile and reply, "It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to achieve perfect cleanliness, then yes, it's inefficient. You'll fail either way, but you'll be miserable failing. If you're trying to be present, to care for something without attachment to perfect outcomes, then circles are the most efficient path of all." Years later, when Koji became a teacher himself, he would always observe how new students approached their tasks. When he saw someone fighting against imperfection, making themselves miserable in pursuit of an impossible standard, he would suggest they try moving in circles for a while. Perfection is a straight line that doesn't exist, he would tell them, but presence, care, acceptance, these are circles that spiral deeper and deeper into understanding. Don't fight against the nature of things. Work with it. Dance with it. Sweep in circles until you understand that the imperfect is already perfect, exactly as it is. As you rest tonight, you might consider this teaching. Where in your life are you sweeping in rigid straight lines, exhausting yourself trying to achieve a perfection that doesn't exist? What would happen if you moved in circles instead? If you let go of the end point and simply engaged fully with the present moment, imperfection and all? The courtyard of your life will never be perfectly clean. Leaves will fall. Wind will blow. This is not failure. This is life. And when you stop fighting against it, when you sweep in circles with presence and care, you might discover that what you thought was imperfect was actually complete all along. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. On the coast of a small fishing village, there lived an old fisherman named Takeshi who had cast his nets into the sea for more than 50 years. While other fishermen in the village would return each day with boats full of fish, Takeshi's catch was often modest. Yet he seemed more content than any of them, humming to himself as he mended his nets, smiling at the horizon as if it were an old friend. The other fishermen couldn't understand it. They had newer boats, stronger nets, better equipment. They worked longer hours, went farther out to sea, employed every technique they knew to maximize their catch. Yet they always seemed worried about competition, worried about the weather, worried about next season, worried about whether they were catching enough. One day, a young fisherman named Hiro, ambitious and frustrated by his own mediocre catches despite his hard work, approached Takeshi as the old man sat mending his net on the dock. "Old uncle," Hiro said, using the term of respect though they weren't related, "may I ask you something?" Takeshi looked up, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Of course, young one. Sit." Hiro sat beside him, watching the old man's gnarled fingers work the net with practiced ease. "How do you stay so peaceful? Your catch is often smaller than ours, yet you never seem worried. You never seem to be rushing or striving. What is your secret?" Takeshi held up a section of his net, spreading it between his hands so the light came through the gaps. "Tell me, Hiro, what is a net made of?" Hiro looked at the net, confused by the simple question. Rope, I suppose. Woven rope with knots. Look closer, Takeshi said, shaking the net gently. What else do you see? Hiro studied it more carefully. The rope formed a pattern, yes, but between each strand. Holes, he said. The net is full of holes. Exactly, Takeshi said, his eyes twinkling. A net is more whole than rope, yes. The holes are what make it a net. Without the holes, it would just be a sheet of cloth, useless for catching fish. I don't understand what this has to do with my question. Takeshi set down the net and looked out at the water. When I was young, like you, I wanted to catch every fish in the sea. I would cast my net and then grip the ropes so tightly, pulling hard, afraid that fish would escape. My hands would bleed from holding so tight. My arms would ache from pulling so hard. And you know what happened? What? The fish would sense the violence of it, the desperation. The net would move through the water roughly, and fish would avoid it. Or they would escape through holes that my tight gripping actually made larger. The harder I tried to hold everything, the more I lost. Hiro leaned forward, interested now. One day, Takeshi continued, I was very tired. My hands hurt. My heart hurt from constant worry. I cast my net almost carelessly, too exhausted to grip tight, too worn out to pull hard. I just let the net sink naturally, let the current move it gently, and pulled it back with soft hands. And that day, my catch was the best I'd ever had. I don't see how that's possible, Hiro said. If you don't hold tight, won't everything escape? Takeshi picked up the net again. Watch. He held one section very tightly in his fist. When I clench like this, look what happens to the net. The holes close up, the rope bunches. The net becomes smaller, more rigid. Now watch. He opened his hand, holding the net loosely across his palm. See? The holes open, the net expands. It becomes larger, more flexible. It can hold more because I'm holding it less. He let the net rest on his lap and looked at Hiro with those eyes that had seen half a century of sunrises over water. This is true for fish, and it's true for everything else in life. The tighter we grip, the more we lose. The more desperately we hold on, the more brittle things become. But when we hold loosely, gently, with open hands, things stay naturally. But isn't that risky? Hiro asked. What if everything falls through? What is falling through right now? Takeshi asked gently. You have a boat. You have nets. You have your health. You have this sea. What exactly are you afraid of losing that you don't already risk losing by worrying about it constantly? Hiro had no answer. He realized he spent so much energy protecting what he had, so much effort trying to guarantee future security, that he was exhausted and unhappy even though nothing had actually gone wrong yet. I see in you what I was, Takeshi said. You grip your life with tight fists. Your boat, your catch, your reputation, your future. You're trying to hold all of it so tightly that your hands hurt and your heart is tired. But you cannot control the sea. You cannot control the fish. You cannot control tomorrow. The only thing your tight grip accomplishes is making you suffer today. So what should I do? Hiro asked. Cast your net with care, but without desperation. Pull it back with attention, but without force. Let the sea be the sea. Let the fish be the fish. Do your work, do it well, but hold the results loosely. Some days the catch will be good, some days it will be modest, some days the net will come back empty. All of this is part of fishing, part of life. When you stop fighting against this truth, when you stop gripping so tightly, something relaxes. And often, that's when everything you need comes naturally. Hiro sat with this teaching for a long time, watching the waves, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. He thought about how tightly he had been holding everything in his life, his ambitions, his worries, his plans, his fears. His whole body ached from the effort of it. The next morning, when Hiro went out to fish, he tried something different. He cast his net with the same care as always, but without the desperate energy he usually brought. He didn't clench the ropes. He didn't pull with all his might. He simply allowed the net to do what a net does, and he guided it gently back to the boat. His catch that day wasn't dramatically bigger, but he noticed something else. The work felt easier. His shoulders didn't ache as much. His mind wasn't churning with anxiety. And when some fish escaped through the holes, which they always did, which they always would, he didn't feel it as a personal failure. It was just fish being fish. Over time, Hiro's entire approach to fishing changed. And gradually, his entire approach to life changed with it. He held his plans more loosely. He gripped his expectations less tightly. He let people in his life be who they were without trying to control them. He stopped trying to grip the future with tight fists. Years later, young fishermen would come to Hiro, asking the same question he had once asked Takeshi, and he would show them a net, spreading it in the light, teaching them about the holes that make it work. Life is like this net, he would say. It's mostly empty space, mostly things we cannot hold or control. And that's not a problem. That's what makes it work. Hold everything loosely, your work, your relationships, your achievements, your plans. Hold them with care, yes, but without that desperate grip that closes up the holes and makes everything smaller, harder, more brittle. Open your hands. Let life flow through them. You'll lose some things, yes, but you'll find you can hold so much more when you stop holding so tightly. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you might notice where you're gripping too tightly. What are you holding with clenched fists? What are you trying to control that cannot be controlled? What would happen if you opened your hands just a little and held everything more gently? The net of your life is mostly holes, mostly space, mostly mystery. This is not a flaw in the design. This is what makes it work. Hold it loosely. Let the holes be holes. Let some things escape. You cannot catch everything, and you were never meant to. But what stays when you hold it gently stays because it wants to, not because you forced it. And that makes all the difference. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In a mountain monastery, there hung an ancient bronze bell in the temple courtyard. For 300 years, this bell had marked the rhythms of monastic life, calling monks to meditation at dawn, to meals at midday, to evening prayers as the sun set behind the peaks. Its deep, resonant tone could be heard throughout the valley, a voice of bronze that spoke of continuity, of tradition, of the sacred order of things. The monastery's youngest monk, a boy named Jairo, who had arrived only months before, had never known silence. He had grown up in a busy city where noise was constant. Street vendors calling, cartwheels clattering, neighbors arguing, merchants haggling, temple bells of a dozen different shrines all competing to be heard. When he came to the monastery, that single bell had seemed like a blessing. Just one sound, pure and clear, marking time with dignity. But Jiro took the bell for granted. He had heard it so many times that he no longer really heard it at all. It was just background, just part of the environment, no more remarkable than the sound of wind or the call of birds. When it rang for dawn meditation, he would stumble from his sleeping mat, still half asleep. When it rang for meals, he was often already hungry and irritated by the wait. The bell was just a signal, a command, nothing more. One autumn, the monastery's abbot, a man named Eshun, who rarely spoke but seemed to notice everything, made an unusual decision. Without explanation or announcement, he ordered that the bell should not be rung. Not for one day, but indefinitely. The bell ringer, a senior monk who had performed this duty for 20 years, looked confused but obeyed. The next morning, Jiro woke in darkness, unsure of the time. He lay there waiting for the familiar sound that would tell him dawn had arrived, that it was time to rise, time to begin the day. But no sound came. He waited longer, growing anxious. Had he somehow slept through it? Was he late? Would he be in trouble? Finally, he stumbled out into the courtyard and found other monks there, all looking similarly confused. Some had woken too early and been waiting. Others, like Jiro, had woken late, uncertain. Master Eshun appeared and said only, "No bell today. Perhaps no bell tomorrow. We shall see. Now please sit for meditation." They sat, but Jiro found it almost impossible to concentrate. He kept listening for the bell. His body expected it. His mind waited for it. Even though he knew it wouldn't ring, he couldn't stop anticipating its sound. The silence where the bell should have been was louder than the bell itself had ever been. At midday, there was no bell to call them to their meal. Some monks arrived too early and had to wait. Others came too late and found the food already distributed. The careful rhythm of the day, which had been marked by the bell for 300 years, had suddenly disappeared. Time became elastic, uncertain, strange. Evening came with no bell to mark the day's transition into night. Jiro sat in the courtyard, looking at the bell hanging silent in its wooden frame. He had passed this bell dozens of times each day for months. But he realized now that he had never really looked at it. Now, in its silence, he saw it clearly for the first time. He noticed the beautiful patina of the bronze, the way 3 centuries of weather had given it a green-black color that seemed to hold depth, like looking into deep water. He saw the intricate decorations cast into its surface, dragons and lotus flowers, and Sanskrit characters worn smooth by time. He noticed how the bell hung perfectly balanced, how the slightest touch would set it swinging, ready to speak at any moment, but choosing silence instead. Days passed, then weeks. The monks adapted to life without the bell. They learned to sense the time from the light, from the position of shadows, from the feeling in their own bodies. They became more attentive to natural rhythms, rather than relying on the bronze voice to tell them what to do. But something else happened too. The bell's absence created a different kind of presence. Monks found themselves thinking about it constantly. The silence, where the bell should have been became a teaching in itself. One evening, Jiro approached Master Eshun in the garden. "Master," he said, bowing, "may I ask why the bell no longer rings?" Eshun looked up from the herbs he was tending. "Does it not ring? Or do you finally hear it?" Jiro frowned, confused. "I hear nothing, Master. That's the problem. The bell is silent." "Sit," Eshun said, gesturing to the ground beside him. Jiro sat. "When the bell rang every day," Eshun said, "did you hear it?" "Of course, Master. We all heard it." "Did you really?" "Tell me about the sound. Describe it to me." Jiro opened his mouth and found he couldn't. He had heard the bell hundreds of times, but he couldn't describe its tone, its resonance, its particular voice. He had heard it so often that he had stopped actually listening. "You heard the command," Eshun said gently. "Wake up. Come here. Do this. But did you hear the bell itself? Did you appreciate its voice? Did you feel gratitude for its faithful service? Or had it become invisible to you, just part of the background noise of your life?" Jiro felt something catch in his throat. The master was right. He had taken the bell completely for granted. "Now," Eshun continued, "now that it's silent, you think about it constantly. You notice it. You see it hanging there. You appreciate what it was. The absence has taught you to see what presence never could. This is why the bell is silent. Not because I wanted to take it away from you, but because I wanted to give it back to you. Sometimes we must lose something to truly find it." Jiro looked at the bell hanging in the courtyard, silhouetted against the darkening sky. He understood now. When the bell rang, it was just a tool, just a function. But in its silence, it had become a teacher. "There is another lesson here," Eshun said, standing up and brushing dirt from his robes. "We spend our lives filling every moment with sound, with activity, with doing. We are afraid of silence, afraid of absence, afraid of empty space. But silence teaches, absence reveals. The spaces between notes are what make music music. The pauses between words are what make speech meaningful. The rest between breaths is what makes breathing possible." He started walking toward the temple, then paused and looked back at Jiro. "The bell will ring again someday. But when it does, I hope you will hear it differently. I hope you will hear not just the sound, but the silence it emerges from. Not just the command it carries, but the gift it offers. And I hope you will remember that sometimes the deepest teaching comes not from what is present, but from what is absent." That night, lying on his sleeping mat, Jiro listened to the silence, where the bell should have been. But it wasn't really silence, he realized. He could hear wind moving through trees. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the small sounds of the monastery settling into sleep. These sounds had always been there, but the bell had covered them. Its absence revealed a whole world of subtle sound he had never noticed. 3 months later, on the first morning of winter, Master Ishan gave the signal. The bell rang again. The sound that rolled across the courtyard was the most beautiful thing Jiro had ever heard. It was deep and rich and full of resonance. It spoke of time and patience and faithful service. It spoke of continuity and change. It spoke of presence and absence, sound and silence, all woven together. Tears came to Jiro's eyes as he listened. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of finally, truly hearing something he had taken for granted for so long. From that day forward, every time the bell rang, Jiro would pause, really pause, and listen. And in listening to the bell, he learned to listen to everything more deeply. He learned that things reveal themselves most fully when we risk losing them. He learned that absence can be a kind of presence. He learned that what we take for granted becomes invisible until it's taken away. Years later, when Jiro became the bell ringer himself, he would sometimes let a full day pass in silence, just as Master Eshun had done. The younger monks would complain, would feel lost without their marker, their signal, their command. And Jiro would smile, remembering his own confusion, his own eventual understanding. The bell is always teaching, he would tell them, in sound and in silence, in presence and in absence. When you learn to hear both, you begin to understand that they are not opposites, but partners in the same dance. As you settle into rest tonight, you might notice what's absent from this moment, not in a sad way, but with curiosity. What sounds are you not hearing? What worries are not present right now? What problems are not demanding your attention in this very instant? Absence has gifts to offer. The space where sound isn't is what makes sound possible. The silence where words aren't is what makes words meaningful. The emptiness where thought isn't is what makes awareness possible. Let yourself rest in what's not here, not as loss, but as space. Empty space, silent space, open space. And in that space, you might discover a presence more profound than anything that makes noise or demands attention. You might discover that sometimes the deepest teaching, the deepest rest, the deepest peace comes not from adding something, but from letting something fall away. The bell is silent now, and in that silence, everything speaks. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.